Story 1. The Treacherous Road. Alright, let's dive into our first story. This one comes from a guy who, along with his girlfriend, shares a deep love for the great outdoors. They're the type of couple that can't stand being cooped up inside. If there's an adventure to be had, they're on it. Their work life is a bit unconventional. They're not tied to the typical 9-to-5 grind. They have the flexibility to set their own schedules, working for themselves, but under the umbrella of a larger company. This freedom allows them to be spontaneous, which is exactly how this particular nightmare began. One afternoon, on a complete whim, they decided to pack their bags for a week-long camping trip. They were headed to a state park they knew of, a place that had a lenient policy. You could camp for up to 2 weeks without needing any permits or prior approval. It was the perfect spot for a last-minute escape. As dusk began to settle, they found themselves navigating a long, winding dirt road leading deeper into the park. This is where the narrator admits to making a critical, life-altering mistake. He was driving, and for some reason, the thought to switch on his high beams never crossed his mind. Compounding this error, he was also driving far too fast for the rugged terrain and the encroaching darkness. In a horrifying split second, the world shifted. His girlfriend, who we'll call Jessica, let out a blood-curdling scream. There, illuminated just feet in front of their truck, was a massive downed tree blocking the entire road. He slammed on the brakes, a desperate, futile attempt to defy physics, but it was too late. The impact was violent and jarring. He blacked out for a few seconds, and when he came to, a disorienting grogginess enveloped him, accompanied by an intense ringing in his ears. But his first and only thought was for Jessica. He turned to the passenger seat. In the dim, ethereal glow of the moonlight filtering through the shattered windshield, he could see her face. She was unconscious, her eyes closed. He shouted her name, his voice filled with rising panic, but she remained unresponsive. Fumbling for his phone, he switched on the flashlight, the stark beam cutting through the darkness. He wasn't sure what he was bracing himself for, but what he saw was beyond his worst imaginings. The first thing that registered was the blood. It was a stark, shocking crimson against her white shirt. Then his eyes were drawn to the source. A tree branch, about the thickness of a finger, had punched through the windshield and was now impaling her chest. It was still attached to the larger tree they had crashed into. A wave of pure terror washed over him. He knew he couldn't shake her or move her, terrified of causing more internal damage. His mind raced, searching for a solution in the suffocating isolation. He tried calling 911, but as expected in such a remote area, there was no service. The truck's engine was dead. Striving for help was not an option.
Ow.
His thoughts latched onto the small pocket knife he carried. The only logical plan he could form in his panicked state was to sever the branch from the tree, carefully get Jessica out of the truck, and lay her by the side of the road. This way he could run for help without the fear of another vehicle crashing into their wreckage and making the situation catastrophically worse. He scrambled onto the hood of the mangled truck and began desperately sawing at the branch. But the knife was small and the wood was thick. He was making no progress, and with every passing second, his panic intensified. It had already been 30 minutes, and Jessica hadn't stirred. He climbed back into the truck, a sense of utter helplessness crushing him. In that moment of desperation, he did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He began to pray. He prayed with an intensity born of pure fear, the minutes stretching into what felt like an eternity. Another 30 minutes crawled by. A tiny, fragile sliver of hope remained, because she wasn't actively bleeding out. The branch had missed the center of her chest, and he clung to the hope that it had bypassed her heart. He felt for her pulse. It was weak, a faint, thready flutter, but it was there. All he could do was wait. And then, a flicker of light appeared in the distance behind them. It grew brighter, flooding the cab of the truck. It was another vehicle. He scrambled out, waving his arms and screaming with all the air in his lungs. The truck, a rugged-looking pickup, stopped behind them. A man rolled down his window, his face etched with concern, asking what was wrong. The narrator's words tumbled out in a frantic, incoherent rush. The man calmly told him to slow down, to breathe. He took a deep breath and explained the situation again, more clearly this time. The man's expression shifted instantly from concern to shock. He got out of his truck, flashlight in hand, and walked over to the passenger side of the wreck. He shined the beam on Jessica and let out a curse under his breath. He told the narrator that their only chance was to cut the branch and get her down the mountain to an EMT station he knew of. He, too, had no cell service. In the back of his truck, he had a chainsaw. The thought of the chainsaw's vibrations coursing through the branch and into Jessica's body was terrifying, but they were out of options. The man started the chainsaw, the roar echoing through the silent woods. He began sawing about a foot from her chest. The narrator covered her with a blanket to shield her from the flying sawdust. The vibration shook her body, but she remained unconscious. Finally, the branch was severed. The man helped him gently lift Jessica from the truck and lay her down in the back seat of his pickup. The narrator jumped into the passenger seat, and the man turned the truck around and sped down the mountain. The drive to the EMT station, a place the narrator hadn't even known existed, took a grueling 20 minutes. The EMTs were startled by their sudden arrival, but immediately sprang into action, loading Jessica into an ambulance. The narrator rode with her to the nearest hospital, which thankfully wasn't far. However, it wasn't a trauma center. She needed to be airlifted to a larger hospital in the city, an hour away by helicopter. The diagnosis was a punctured lung. Miraculously, she hadn't lost a significant amount of blood, and the branch had missed her heart by a mere inch. The doctor's words were chilling. If it had been just an inch to the left, she would have died within minutes. Jessica remained in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. When she finally woke up, the pain in her chest was so immense that she could barely speak. Her hospital stay stretched to over 2 months, filled with intensive surgeries to repair the extensive damage. The possibility of a future lung transplant still looms. While she was still in the hospital recovering, he asked her to marry him. She said yes. Today, Jessica is still on oxygen and struggles with her breathing. He takes her to all her monthly appointments, and they are doing everything in their power to help her on the road to a full recovery. Though the VA had to come to terms with the fact that she may never be the same. He says he's endlessly grateful that she survived and has stayed in close contact with the man who saved her life. He struggles with the guilt of that night, the memory a constant, heavy weight, but through it all, he finds solace in the fact that it's a burden he carries alone. A nightmare that Jessica, mercifully, doesn't have to remember. Story 2. The Tinder deception. This next story is a cautionary tale about the unpredictable and sometimes dangerous world of online dating. The narrator begins by acknowledging the inherent insanity of it all. You swipe through pictures, chat with a stranger, and then agree to meet them, with no real certainty that they are who they claim to be. It's a gamble she wishes she had understood before she downloaded Tinder. She had been on a few dates through the app before, but nothing had ever clicked. It was the usual mixed bag of experiences. Guys who were only looking for a hookup, those who were clearly not ready for anything serious, and the occasional creep. But she hadn't encountered anything truly alarming until she matched with a guy who seemed almost too good to be true. His pictures were stunning, and when he messaged her, she was thrilled. The more they talked, the more her excitement grew. They had so much in common, and he was charming, funny, and seemed to be everything she was looking for. After about a week of constant communication, he asked her out. She suggested a casual bar near her house, her usual first date strategy that allowed for a quick exit if things went south. However, he insisted on dinner, arguing it was the gentlemanly thing to do. Despite her reservations, she was so taken with him, who we'll call Oliver, that she agreed. Then came the next red flag. He insisted on picking her up. She knew it was a risky move, giving her address to someone she'd never met in person, but her excitement and optimism clouded her judgment. She gave him her address, and they made plans for him to pick her up at 7:00 p.m. the next day. Her friends, upon hearing the plan, didn't mince words, calling her an idiot for being so reckless. She brushed off their concerns, attributing them to jealousy. The next evening, she was filled with anticipation as she got ready. At precisely 7:00, her doorbell rang. When she opened the door, her excitement instantly deflated. The man standing before her looked nothing like his pictures. Well, not nothing. It was recognizably the same person. But the photos were clearly from a decade, maybe even 15 years prior. The handsome man from the profile had aged, and not particularly gracefully. She was taken aback, but decided to go through with the date, hoping his personality would make up for the blatant deception. He was overly complimentary as they got into his car, telling her she was even more beautiful than her pictures. Then, with cringeworthy awkwardness, he asked, "What about me? Am I even more handsome than my pictures?" She was floored. She initially thought he must be joking, that there was no way he was unaware of the significant discrepancy between his profile and reality. Unsure how to respond, she opted for a half-truth, a tactic her mother had always advised against. She told him he looked good, but then, driven by curiosity, asked how long ago he had taken the pictures on his profile. The question clearly struck a nerve. His demeanor shifted instantly, and he took offense. She quickly apologized, trying to backtrack, but the damage was done. He gave her the silent treatment for the next 5 minutes, the atmosphere in the car turning thick with resentment. Regret began to set in, sharp and potent. She definitely regretted giving him her address. She was familiar with the route to the restaurant, which was about 30 minutes away. As they drove, she noticed him miss the turn for the restaurant. She pointed it out, suggesting he make a U-turn, but he ignored her. He drove past the next intersection, and a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She told him again, more firmly this time, that he needed to turn around. Still no response. Just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road, refusing to even look at her. They stopped at a red light, and she knew this was her chance to escape. She reached for the door handle, only to find it locked. There was no button to unlock it, and the lock mechanism was internal, making it impossible to open manually. She was trapped. Taking out her phone, she discreetly texted her friend her location. A small act of defiance in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of her control. After what felt like an eternity, Oliver pulled into an empty grocery store parking lot, parking in a secluded spot at the far end. She didn't know his exact plan, but she had a terrifying idea, and she was not going to let it happen. He unbuckled his seatbelt, and as he turned towards her, she reached into her purse. He lunged, grabbing her arms and trying to pin her down. She fought back with everything she had, a desperate struggle in the confines of the car. He momentarily lost his grip on her arm, and in that split second, she pulled out her pepper spray and sprayed him directly in the face. The problem with using pepper spray in such a small space is the blowback. Her own eyes immediately began to burn and water as he screamed beside her, clawing at his face. Amidst the chaos, she managed to reach over and unlock the doors. She shoved her door open and tumbled out onto the asphalt, scraping her knees in the process. Her vision was blurred and her chest burned from inhaling the fumes. She stumbled, trying to make her way across the parking lot, her legs unsteady beneath her. She heard his car door open, and his voice, a mixture of pain and rage, yelling at her to come back. Through her tear-filled eyes, she saw him staggering after her. She screamed for help, but the parking lot was deserted. He started shouting that he was just joking, that he didn't mean to scare her, that if she just came back to the car, they would go to the restaurant as planned. It was a bizarre, terrifying display, his apologies punctuated by screams of pain as the pepper spray continued to burn his eyes. She wondered if he was genuinely delusional enough to think she would believe him. He was closing the distance between them quickly. Just as she reached the entrance of the grocery store, he grabbed her by the shoulders, yanking her back. But the automatic doors had already opened, and she screamed for her life. A man came running out of the store and immediately intervened, telling Oliver to get his hands off her. Oliver released her, and as the man helped her up, her assailant scrambled back to his car and sped away. The police were called, and an investigation was launched, but nothing ever came of it. He was never found. The experience left her deeply paranoid. She moved out of her house and back in with her parents, terrified that he would find her. It's a fear that has lessened with time, but the memory remains a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind a seemingly Story 3. The Stranded Driver. This next story comes from a young woman who was 19 at the time and had just moved across the country for college. She had made the long drive back and forth for school breaks before without any issues. So when winter break rolled around, she didn't think twice about doing it again. Her mom was eager for her to come home for the holidays, and while she agreed, she was hesitant to leave her car behind. Her city had been experiencing a string of car break-ins, and the thought of her car being vandalized or stolen was a constant worry, so she informed her mom she would be driving. Her mother, naturally, was concerned, and even offered to have her dad fly out and make the drive with her. But not wanting to put them through the trouble, she insisted she would be fine. Besides, she was going through some personal issues at the time, and thought a few days on the road by herself would be a good opportunity to clear her head. As she packed her bags, said goodbye to her disappointed roommate, and hit the road. Looking back, she admits her car, a 20-year-old Honda Civic prone to frequent breakdowns, probably wasn't worth the harrowing experience that awaited her. She left early in the morning, grabbing coffee to fuel her for the long hours ahead. Her plan was loose. Drive for about 10 hours and then find a hotel for the night. She followed the fastest route suggested by her GPS, a decision she would later regret as it took her through long, desolate stretches of highway, nothing but empty fields for miles. The first day was uneventful. She found a decent hotel and settled in for the night. The next day's drive would take her through the Midwest. It was winter, so the landscape was bleak and flat, a monotonous backdrop for a long road trip. The day passed more quickly than the previous one, and by the time the sun set around 6 p.m., she was still feeling energetic and decided to push on. Around 7 p.m., a dreaded knocking sound started coming from her engine. Her heart sank. It had started to snow, and her car began to slow down, eventually dying completely on the side of the highway. The cold quickly seeped into the car without the heater running. She checked her phone for the nearest town, but it was almost an hour away. She tried calling her parents, but she had no service. In a moment of desperation, she used the emergency call feature on her phone, and to her relief, it worked. The dispatcher informed her that the closest officer was at least an hour away. She had no choice but to wait. The dispatcher then gave her a chilling piece of advice. Lock the doors and try to make the car look unoccupied. Apparently, the stretch of highway where she had broken down was known for being unsafe for stranded drivers, especially young women. The dispatcher's words sent a wave of nausea through her. Her heart began to race. She put up a sun shield in her front windshield and thankfully had 3 extra ones from a previous car camping trip, which she used to cover the side and back windows, making the interior of the car almost completely dark from the outside. About 30 minutes into her wait, an unnerving feeling washed over her, the distinct sensation of being watched. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a product of her stressful situation. But the feeling persisted, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. There was an instinctual part of her screaming that she was in danger. She turned on her phone's screen, using its dim light to peer through a small, uncovered crack in the passenger side window. Her blood ran cold. Pressed against the glass was the face of a man, a grotesque smile stretched across his features, his eyes staring directly at her. A blood-curdling scream escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The man pulled his face away from the window and began to laugh, a guttural, horrifying sound. He then started violently trying the door handle, rattling the entire car. She was screaming and crying as he circled the vehicle, howling like an animal. It felt like he was taunting her. She called 911 again, her screams making it difficult for the new dispatcher to understand her. This dispatcher was less patient than the first, yelling at her to calm down. The man outside began banging on the window with a hard object, and the dispatcher, unbelievably, accused her of making a prank call and hung up. Utterly helpless, she called again, and this time, a more empathetic dispatcher answered. He calmed her down and informed her that the officer was now only about 10 minutes away. A sliver of hope returned, only to be shattered by the sound of a rock hitting her windshield. The glass fractured, and the man, emboldened, climbed onto the hood of her car and began stomping on the windshield until it broke. He reached a hand inside, and she scrambled into the back seat, trying to get as far away from him as possible. He started tearing away the broken glass, his face even more terrifying up close. Paralyzed with fear, she watched as he began to climb into the car. She knew she had to get out. She opened the back door, turned on her phone's flashlight, and saw, to her immense relief, that he was stuck. The flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in the distance. She frantically waved the officer down, pulled up beside her, and another patrol car arrived moments later. The officers drew their guns, ordering the man to get out of the car. He thrashed and screamed as they pulled him out, handcuffed him, and placed him in the back of one of the patrol cars. She was taken to the police station where she gave her statement. Her parents bought her a plane ticket home from the nearest airport, and the officers were kind enough to drive her there. The man, it turned out, was so mentally unstable that he was deemed unfit to stand trial and was sent to a state mental hospital. She wishes there had been some form of justice for the trauma he inflicted upon her, but she knows that he isn't the one being punished. The memory of that night of his face pressed against the window is a punishment she endures every day. It's a memory that will likely haunt her for the rest of her life. Story 4. The flash flood. This next story is a chilling reminder of how quickly the world we know can be washed away, and how, in our most desperate moments, help can come from the most unexpected places. It's an account of being trapped, abandoned, and ultimately saved, not by the systems we trust, but by the simple decency of strangers. It all started on a Tuesday night. A storm of biblical proportions had parked itself over our town, and I was at my girlfriend's apartment listening to the rain trying to beat its way through the windows. It was cozy, safe. The smart move would have been to stay put, but I had a 5 a.m. shift at the warehouse the next day, and my work clothes, all of them, were at my place. It was only a 10-minute drive, a route I could navigate in my sleep. It was my first mistake, underestimating the storm. When I stepped outside, the wind almost tore the door from my hand. The drive itself was like piloting a submarine through murky water. The rain was a solid wall, my wipers slapping furiously, but doing little more than smearing the deluge across the glass. The power was out across town, so the world was an inky, featureless black, punctuated only by the weak, flickering beam of my headlights. I was driving entirely on instinct, counting the seconds between turns, navigating by the ghost of a road I knew was under there somewhere. I made the final turn onto my street, and the truck suddenly felt wrong. There was a sickening lurch, a feeling of buoyancy as if the tires had lost their connection to the solid earth. My headlights illuminated not my neighbor's prize-winning gardenias, but a churning brown river where our street used to be. Before I could even slam the truck into reverse, the engine sputtered, coughed violently, and died. The lights went with it, plunging me into an absolute, terrifying darkness. For a second, the only sound was the rain and the hungry gurgle of water moving with a purpose I didn't like. I felt the cold seeping through the floorboards. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blindingly bright rectangle in the oppressive dark. The water was already over my boots. The current, far stronger than I would have believed possible, began to push my heavy truck sideways, carrying me further from the road and deeper into the flood. I was no longer a driver. I was cargo in a sinking steel box. My first instinct was to get out. I threw my shoulder against the driver's side door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like pushing against a mountain. The pressure of the water outside was immense, sealing me in. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. My dad's voice echoed in my head, a memory from a long-ago fishing trip. Panic is a weight, son. It'll sink you faster than any flood. Think. Just think. I took a deep, shaky breath and fumbled for the glove box, pulling out the small, waterproof flashlight I kept there. Its beam cut a nervous circle through the cab. I searched desperately for anything I could use to break a window, a tire iron, a wrench, anything. But my mind flashed back to the previous weekend, when I'd meticulously cleaned out the truck, organizing all my tools and putting them away in the garage. My own damned tidiness was going to be the end of me. My only hope was my phone. I dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly it took 3 attempts. The call connected, but not to a human voice. A sterile recorded message informed me that all dispatchers were busy and that my call would be answered in the order it was received. The line filled with a tinny, upbeat hold music that was so grotesquely out of place it felt like a personal insult. The water was at my knees now, shockingly cold. I watched the seconds on my phone's timer tick by. 1 minute. 3 minutes. 5. It was the longest, most agonizing 7 minutes of my life. Finally, a man's voice, rushed and detached, came on the line. 911. What's your emergency? I explained the situation, my voice cracking with panic. My truck is sinking in a flash flood on my street. I can't get out. Okay, sir. What's the address? I gave it to him. I heard the click-clack of a keyboard. All right, he said, his tone flat. We have multiple water rescues in that area. You're not the only one. It will be at least 30 minutes before we can get a unit to you." 30 minutes? I yelled, my voice raw. "I don't have 30 minutes. The water is almost at my chest. I'll be underwater." "Sir, there's nothing else I can do," he said, his voice a wall of indifference. "We are dispatching units as they become available. Please," I begged, my pride washed away by terror. "Can you just stay on the phone with me?" "I can't do that, sir," he replied coolly. "We have to keep the lines open for other emergencies. If your situation worsens, you can call back." And then he hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. The idea of calling back was a joke. If things got worse, I'd be dead. I was completely alone, abandoned by the one service I was taught my entire life to trust. I squatted on my seat, trying to keep my head in the rapidly shrinking pocket of air at the top of the cab. I tried calling my parents, but the call wouldn't go through. Defeated, I opened the voice recorder app on my phone and held it to my mouth. I recorded my goodbyes, telling my family I loved them, my voice choked with sobs. 10 minutes after the 911 call, the water was at my chest. The airspace was down to about a foot. This was it. I started to pray, real, desperate prayers. Another 5 minutes passed, the water was at my neck. I had my cheek pressed against the cold, damp roof of the truck, tears mixing with the condensation. I was only able to breathe through my nose. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost lost in the storm's roar. The high-pitched whine of an outboard motor. My eyes snapped open. I thought I was hallucinating, but it grew louder. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through me. Started screaming, a primal, ragged sound, and flashed my little flashlight at the roof, praying the beam would cut through the darkness. A small aluminum fishing boat, pulled up right next to my truck. A man's weathered face peered down at me. Without a word, he jumped into the churning water, a tool in his hand. With one sharp, explosive crack, he shattered the driver's side window. He reached into the dark water inside the cab. His hand found my shirt, and with a grunt of effort, he pulled me out through the window and into the world of air. I collapsed onto the deck of the boat, gasping and coughing, the cold night air feeling like the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. There were 2 of them wrapped me in a thick blanket. It didn't take me to safety right away. I spent another 20 minutes navigating the flooded streets, rescuing a family from their porch and another man from the roof of his car. When we finally reached a dry intersection where emergency vehicles were staged, I was taken to an ambulance. Later, sitting in the back, a firefighter asked me which rescue unit had picked me up. I described the fishing boat. He shook his head. "Son," he said gently, "all our boats are still on the other side of town. That wasn't us. That was just some local guys with a boat who heard people were in trouble." The words hit me harder than the cold. I'd been left to die by the system and saved by my neighbors. Experience left scars that no one can see. I have nightmares about drowning. Bad storm still makes my heart pound. But I am alive. I am alive because on the darkest night of my life, when the systems we build failed, the humanity within our community did not. And that is a truth for which I am both eternally grateful and eternally haunted. Story 5. The Hallucinations on the Highway. This next story is a profoundly unsettling journey into the fragile landscape of the human mind. It's a tale that blurs the line between a terrifying encounter and a medical emergency, ultimately revealing that sometimes our greatest fears can be a signpost pointing toward an even more frightening truth. It's a story about how one man's descent into what he thought was madness was actually his body's desperate, last-ditch effort to save his life. Our narrator, who we'll call Mark, worked in construction. It was hard, honest work, but the hours were brutal. His story begins at the end of a particularly grueling stretch at nearly 24-hour shift pushed on him and his crew by a looming deadline. When he finally stumbled to his truck, it was almost 3 o'clock in the morning. He'd been awake for the better part of 2 days, fueled by little more than lukewarm coffee and sheer willpower. His body ached, his thoughts were thick and slow, and the only thing he wanted was the sweet oblivion of his bed. He knew he shouldn't be driving. It was beyond reckless. But the pull of home was a siren song he couldn't resist. The drive was a hypnotic, dangerous blur. The highway lights smeared into long watercolor streaks. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead. He kept snapping awake from those terrifying microsleeps, his head jolting up. the truck drifting toward the shoulder, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was in one of these moments of bleary-eyed consciousness that he saw her. There, on the grassy shoulder of the deserted highway, sat a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, her knees pulled up to her chest, illuminated for a fleeting moment by his headlights. He drove past, his exhausted brain struggling to make sense of the image. Did I really just see that? A little girl, out here, in the middle of the night? He tried to dismiss it as a phantom, a hallucination born of extreme fatigue. But the image was seared into his mind. His conscience, a stubborn and persistent voice, started screaming at him. He couldn't just leave a child on the side of the road. With a heavy sigh of resignation, he found a place to turn around. He pulled up slowly, his tires crunching on the gravel. The girl looked up, her face pale and emotionless in the dim glow of his dashboard. He rolled down his window. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She just stared at him with wide, vacant eyes. The silence was heavy, unnerving. Leaving her there was not an option. "Look," he said, trying to sound as unthreatening as possible. "Get in. I'm not going to hurt you. I'll take you to the police station. We'll get you back to your family." After a long, silent moment, she stood, walked to the passenger side, and climbed into the truck. He pulled back onto the highway, his mind reeling. He tried again to get her to talk. "What's your name? Where do you live?" Nothing. She just sat there, a silent, unnerving passenger, her gaze fixed on him. The quiet in the cab was thick with unspoken questions. About 10 minutes later, his headlights caught another figure on the side of the road. This time, it was a little boy, about the same age. Mark's heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be happening. He pulled over. Just like the girl, the boy climbed in without a word and began staring at him. He felt like he had driven into an episode of The Twilight Zone. He drove on. The two silent children, his unwilling co-pilots, the situation escalating from strange to deeply disturbing. Another 15 minutes passed. Then he saw at the sight that shattered his remaining composure. On the shoulder, sitting starkly and impossibly alone, was a baby's car seat. He slammed on the brakes. He got out, his legs feeling unsteady, and approached it, half convinced it would be empty. But it wasn't. A tiny baby lay inside, looking up at him. This was too real. He carefully lifted the car seat, placed it in the back with his other phantom passengers. And the moment he got a single bar of cell service, he called the police. The dispatcher listened calmly to his frantic, jumbled story and instructed him to drive to the nearest hospital, assuring him that officers would meet him there. A wave of relief washed over him. He was doing the right thing. He pulled up to the emergency room, got the heavy car seat out of the back, and told the two older children to follow him. They trailed silently behind him as he walked through the automatic doors. He rushed to the front desk. "I found these kids," he blurted out to the receptionist. "On the highway? They need help." The woman behind the counter looked up at him, her face a mask of confusion. "Sir? What children?" she asked, her eyes scanning the empty lobby behind him. "Right here," he insisted, his voice rising in frustration. He gestured to the children standing beside him. "The baby looks cold." The receptionist looked from his wild eyes down to the object in his arms, and her expression softened into one of pity. "Sir," she said gently, "you're carrying a tool bag. There are no children here. Why don't you have a seat?" His world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked down, saw the car seat, the baby. He looked up and saw two police officers approaching, their faces etched with the same gentle concern. He told them the story again, pointing, pleading, begging them to see what he saw. But they just saw a man, bone-weary and covered in grime, cradling a heavy tool bag as if it were a child, pointing at empty air. They sat him down. They spoke to him in calm, measured tones. They told him he was safe, but that he was clearly experiencing some sort of psychotic episode. He insisted he was fine, that he'd never had mental health issues. But his reality and theirs were irreconcilable. For his own safety and the potential safety of others, he was admitted on a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The next few days were a waking nightmare of white rooms and probing questions. The children were still there. They were his constant companions, silent ghosts in his peripheral vision. At first, they were a strange comfort, the only proof he wasn't completely losing his mind. But soon they became a terrifying symbol of his fractured reality. Then, the other symptoms began. He started having trouble speaking, his thoughts tangling before he could get them out. The doctors, who had initially suspected sleep deprivation, began to realize something more was at play. They ran scans, but the initial results were inconclusive. They were preparing to discharge him, to send him back into the world with a diagnosis that would haunt him forever. They decided on one last MRI. As Mark lay in the claustrophobic tube, he prayed for an answer, any answer, and this time they found it. A sharp-eyed radiologist spotted a faint shadow on his frontal lobe. It was a brain tumor, small but malignant, and located in a position that explained everything. It was pressing on his optic nerve, creating the vivid, unshakable hallucinations. It was disrupting the very parts of his brain that controlled language and reason. The tumor was inoperable, but it had been found early, so early that his prognosis was good. As he began chemotherapy and radiation, the children began to disappear. First the girl, then the boy, and finally the baby in the car seat vanished from his sight. He was getting better. Mark often thinks back to that night. He knows with a certainty that chills him to the bone that if his brain hadn't created those phantoms, if he hadn't seen those children on the side of the road, he never would have gone to the hospital. The cancer would have grown silent and deadly until it was too late. In the most terrifying and surreal way imaginable, the hallucinations that almost cost him his sanity are the very reason he is alive today. Story 6. The gang initiation. This next story is a hard one to tell, and it's a hard one to hear. It's a raw, unflinching look at how one night of dumb, teenage rebellion can intersect with a kind of random, predatory violence that most of us only see in movies. It comes from a man looking back at himself at 16, and is a brutal reminder that the world outside our front door can be far more dangerous than our youthful arrogance allows us to believe. He starts by painting a painfully honest picture of himself at that age. In his own words, he was a typical self-absorbed idiot, buzzing with that restless energy that makes a Friday night feel like the most important event in the universe. All he wanted was to take the car and meet up with his friends. It was a simple request in his mind. But his mom saw something else. She had that parental sixth sense, an intuition honed by years of worrying, and she was adamant. He was not taking the car. She was convinced it would lead to drinking, to recklessness, to a phone call in the middle of the night that she never wanted to get. He argued, he pleaded, he made promises he probably had no intention of keeping, but she stood firm, a wall of parental authority he couldn't break through. In a final childish fit of rage, he hurled the words at her that every teenager regrets the second they leave their mouth. "I hate you." He stormed off to his room, slamming the door. But the argument wasn't over. He just decided to win it on his own terms. He was going to sneak out. Around 11 p.m., the house fell into that deep, suburban quiet. Mom was asleep, and his dad was out of town, a perfect storm of opportunity. He'd pocketed the car keys during the argument, a small act of premeditated rebellion. He slipped out his bedroom window, his sneakers landing softly on the damp lawn. The cool night air felt like freedom. He moved with the stealth of a cat burglar, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The sound of the car engine turning over felt like a cannon shot in the stillness, and he pulled away from the curb before he could change his mind. His first act as a free man was to disable the Life 360 app on his phone. He was off the grid. He texted his friends a triumphant message. The reply came back. They were in Los Angeles. From his quiet suburb, LA was over an hour away, an epic journey that felt like a pilgrimage into the heart of adulthood. A small rational part of his brain whispered that it was too far, too late. But the voice of teenage invincibility shouted it down. Of course he was going to go. The initial drive was pure bliss. Music blasting, windows down, the endless ribbon of the freeway spooling out before him. But this is Southern California, and the beast of traffic never truly sleeps. Impatient and convinced of his own cleverness, he veered off the freeway, diving into a web of side streets. Sure, he could find a shortcut. The well-lit boulevards soon gave way to darker, narrower roads. The neighborhoods became unfamiliar, then unsettling. The thrill of his escape began to curdle into a cold knot of anxiety. The freedom he craved was starting to feel like a trap.
What?
He was completely, utterly lost.
At.
The bravado evaporated, and in its place was a raw, childish fear. For the first time all night, he genuinely just wanted his mom. He turned down another dark, narrow street, hoping it would magically lead him back to civilization. That's when he saw it. A large truck parked sideways, completely blocking the road. It wasn't an accident, it was a barricade. His blood ran cold. He slammed the car into reverse, but it was too late. A figure detached itself from the shadows and was at his window in a heartbeat pounding on the glass. In the man's hand, glinting under a distant streetlight, was a gun. His world shrank to the size of that dark metal object. A voice, low and menacing, ordered him to open the door and get out. His body moved on its own, numb with a terror so profound it felt like paralysis. He was yanked from the car, the rough hands a shocking violation, and thrown onto the cold, gritty asphalt. He saw other figures emerge from the darkness, a half-dozen of them, just watching. Then another man ran up and began to kick him, methodically, viciously. Each blow to his torso was a starburst of pain that stole his breath. He begged them to stop, his voice a pathetic whimper that was answered only by their laughter. As he lay there, helpless, he thought of his parents. The image of their faces was the only thing he could hold on to. He realized the beating wasn't going to end soon, so he curled into a tight ball, a primal instinct to protect himself. But it was a mistake. The man who was kicking him seemed to take it as a new invitation. His booted foot came down, not on his back or his ribs, but with calculated force, directly onto his jaw. There was a sickening, wet crunch, a flash of white-hot agony, and then, mercifully, a wave of adrenaline that numbed everything. Then it was over. The violence stopped as abruptly as it began. He lay still, pretending to be unconscious. Through his eyelids, he saw the blinding flashes of their phone cameras. They were taking pictures, documenting their work like a trophy. He heard them laugh as they rifled through his pockets, taking his keys, his wallet, his phone. He heard the sound of his mom's car starting, and then the squeal of tires as they drove off, leaving him bleeding and broken in the middle of an anonymous street. His last thought before the darkness took him was of his mother, and how the last thing he had ever said to her was that he hated her. The next thing he knew, he was blinking up at the blurry, concerned faces of paramedics. He was in an ambulance, the siren wailing. He woke up a week later in a hospital bed. The first sensation was a strange tightness in his mouth, a web of wires holding his shattered jaw together. His mom was sitting in a chair by his bed, her face a geography of grief and exhaustion. He told his story to her and to the police, his words muffled and painful. The officers listened grimly. It had all the hallmarks, they said, of a gang initiation. It was just a random target in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was lucky, they said, to be alive. The doctors confirmed just how lucky. The list of his injuries was a litany of violence. Multiple broken ribs, massive internal bleeding from a lacerated spleen, a broken nose, and other severe facial fractures. But then came the final, most chilling detail, the one that spoke to a level of cruelty beyond a simple mugging. The doctors told him that both of his Achilles tendons had been slit. It wasn't just a beating. It was a deliberate act of crippling. He spent months in the hospital, his life becoming a cycle of surgeries and agonizing physical therapy. He says he feels stupid for what he did, for the arrogance and disrespect. But he knows now that what happened to him wasn't a normal consequence of teenage rebellion. It was a collision with a different, darker world. He ends his story with a hard-earned piece of wisdom. Sometimes your parents really do know best. Their rules and their worries don't come from a desire to ruin your fun. They come from a place of love and a deep, terrifying understanding that there are monsters in the world, just waiting for a lost, reckless kid to turn down the wrong street. Story 7. The Ambush on the Back Road. Our final story for tonight is a chilling testament to a parent's intuition and the terrifying reality that sometimes the monsters are not just in stories, they're waiting on a dark road. It's about how a routine drive can become a fight for survival, and how the feeling of being watched can be the only warning you get. This account comes from a woman who was 29 at the time, a young mother who found herself in a situation that would test her nerve to its absolute limit. She and her husband had planned a 2-week visit to his parents' house, a lovely property nestled in the countryside outside the city. It was a trip they were all looking forward to. Her husband's work schedule was demanding, and he had to stay late that day. So they came up with a practical plan. She and their 5-year-old daughter would drive out first in the afternoon, get settled in, and he would follow a few hours later. It was a simple, logical arrangement. It was deep winter, the kind that steals the daylight early. They left around 3 p.m., and by 4:30, the sky was already bruised with the colors of sunset, quickly giving way to a deep, starless black. They were on a familiar back road, a 2-lane ribbon of asphalt that cut through miles of dense, silent forest. There were no streetlights, no houses, just the lonely beam of her headlights carving a path through the darkness. She'd driven this road countless times and never felt anything but a sense of peaceful solitude. But tonight, something felt different. The darkness felt heavier, the woods more watchful. She glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror, asleep in her car seat, and tried to shake off the unease. They were about 30 minutes from her in-laws' house when she saw it. It's a pair of flashing yellow lights, blinking rhythmically in the distance. Hazard lights. As she got closer, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The car wasn't pulled over on the narrow shoulder. It was stopped dead in the middle of her lane, angled slightly as if the driver had lost control. Her immediate instinct was to slow down, to be cautious. Her mind started running through the possibilities. Engine trouble, a flat tire, but why stop in the middle of the road? She brought her car to a stop a good 100 feet away, the space between them feeling like a chasm of uncertainty. Her mind was a flurry of conflicting impulses. The decent, helpful part of her wanted to see if they were okay. But the other part of her, the mother, the woman alone with her child on a desolate road, was screaming a warning. The calculus of risk changes completely when you have a small, vulnerable life in the seat behind you. Getting out of the car was not an option. It would be an act of profound foolishness. She decided the best she could do was drive on and call for help for them as soon as she got service. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, debating her next move. Should she try to squeeze past them on the shoulder? Should she attempt a difficult 3-point turn on the narrow road and go back? It was in that moment of hesitation that she happened to glance in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. It's just dark shapes moving against the deeper darkness of the road behind her. Not cars. Something else. They were moving quickly, silently. As they got closer, about 30 feet behind her, the horrifying reality crashed down on her. They were people, 2 of them, and they were running, sprinting directly at her car. Instinct took over. Her brain didn't even have time to form a conscious thought. Her foot slammed down on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward. There was no time to turn around. The only way out was through. She aimed her car for the narrow, muddy shoulder, praying she wouldn't get stuck. As she sped past the stopped car, the scene exploded into chaos. More people, 4 or 5 of them, emerged from the trees on the side of the road, their figures like specters in her headlights. They had been waiting in ambush. They started throwing things at her, rocks, branches, anything they could grab to try and force her to stop. One object, heavy and dense, struck her windshield with a sickening crack. The glass spiderwebbed, and the object flew past her head, landing with a thud in the passenger seat. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound that jolted her daughter awake. The little girl began to scream and cry, her fear amplifying her mother's. "It's okay, sweetie. It's okay," she chanted, her voice trembling, her eyes locked on the road ahead. She didn't dare look back. She just kept her foot pressed to the floor, pushing the car faster and faster. Desperate to put as much distance as possible between them and the nightmare on the road. Finally, she saw the familiar lights of her in-laws' gated community. She practically stood on the brake as she pulled up to the call box, her hands shaking so violently she could barely push the button. The moment she heard her father-in-law's voice, the dam of her composure broke and she dissolved into hysterical sobs. He met her at the driveway, and one look at her face and the shattered windshield told him something was terribly wrong. He took his crying granddaughter into his arms as she stumbled out of the car and tried to explain what had happened. Her father-in-law was a calm, serious man, a former military officer who took security very seriously. He brought them inside, and his protective instincts took over. He immediately went to the security monitors that covered his property. What they saw on the screen made their blood run cold. It was the same car from the road, a beat-up sedan. Driving slowly past their front gate, turning around at the end of the street, and passing by again. They were being cased. He called the police, but the response was disheartening. They were too far outside the city limits, and unless there was an active life-or-death emergency, they couldn't dispatch a unit. They were on their own. Without a word, her father-in-law went to his gun safe. He armed himself, and he armed his wife and her. He told them to stay inside, lock the doors, and stay away from the windows. He called his son, her husband, and told him what was happening, and to be on alert. Then, he walked out into the darkness to patrol his property. They watched on the security monitors, their hearts in their throats. Just as he was approaching the front gate, the sedan pulled up again. This time it stopped. Two men got out and began to push on the heavy iron gate, trying to force it open. They clearly hadn't seen her father-in-law approaching in the darkness. All they could see on the monitor was his figure running toward them. He raised his handgun and fired a single, deafening warning shot into the air. The two men scrambled back into their car as if they'd been electrocuted and sped off into the night. A few days later, they heard on the local news that there had been a string of violent carjackings in the surrounding counties. The method was always the same: a car used as a roadblock on a desolate road. She shudders to think what would have happened if she hadn't trusted that initial feeling of unease. If she hadn't glanced in her rearview mirror at that exact moment. It's a story she tells now as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most important survival tool you have is your own intuition.